Then moving on now through a discussion of the second half of Volume 2 of Rudolf Steiner's Karmic Relationships. At this point, Steiner stops going into past lives for a bit and gives us his cosmology of what happens to the soul, or one version of it, of what happens to the soul after death. And it might be worth reviewing the old Ptolemaic cosmology and the myth of the idea of the soul's incarnation on the earth, as it is given in particular by Cicero in his Republic, where he recounts the dream of Scipio. And he talks about how the original cosmology is that the earth is at the center of the universe, surrounded by the moon, which is then surrounded by Mercury, Venus, and the sun, which in a certain sense is in the center of these planetary spheres, above which then is Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And so Steiner retains this cosmology in terms of what he calls its spiritual version, which applies on the other side, even though he recognizes that the physical cosmology is totally different now, with the Copernican coming in. So what happens in this myth is that the soul it descends through these planetary spheres. And the spheres are made up out of a substance called ether, which turns with its own natural circular motion. And these spheres just turn by themselves. And as they turn, they make sounds. And each one of the sounds that they make corresponds to a different note of the diatonic scale. And also each of the spheres is associated, as in astrology, with a different quality. And so the soul, as it descends through Saturn, it picks up wise old wisdom, or the idea of the senex, the cranky old man. Saturn is the malefic ruler, whereas Jupiter on the next one down is the beneficent ruler, the good kingly disposition. And then down below that, Mars has to do with courage and aggression, or lack thereof. And the sun is simply the waking daylight personality. And then below that, Venus has to do with the realm of the genitals and love and sex and eros and art. And then below that, then we have Mercury, which has to do with the intellect. And then the moon, which has to do with the emotions. And then you're down on Earth. And the soul now has a cosmic map imprinted onto its subtle body, whereby it can then, through various ways of being initiated into the mystery cults or through gnosis, remember its divine origins. And because all of this cosmic wisdom is stored up within it. Now, so in a certain way, Steiner is retrieving this Ptolemaic cosmology and bringing it back as true on the other side being the astral plane, the dimension that he says we enter into after death and in between death and the time of a new birth. And the first thing that he says that happens is that the etheric body withdraws. And remember that the body is made up of a physical body, which is animated by an etheric body that we share in common with plants, which then has an astral body within it, from which we get our emotions, passions, desires, and so forth. And then the ego is the individuality, the I that hops from lifetime to lifetime. And at death, these three bodies withdraw from the physical body, which then decays and disintegrates. And on the other side, in the astral plane, the etheric body is the first thing that gets processed, and it does so very quickly, in the time of about 3 days. And the etheric body contains all of your memories. It not only animates the physical body, but it picks up memories, your personal memories of your most recent life. So that once you get on the other side, the etheric body then unfolds and disintegrates, and as it does so, a panoramic life review is spread out before you, so that the first thing that happens is the so-called life review. And one of the things that cued me to the possibility that Steiner may be actually telling something truthful here, it was then watching near-death experiencers recount that indeed the first thing that happens once they get on the other side is almost invariably a life review. And so this is what happens, and Steiner says it happens in conjunction with the beings on the moon, within the moon sphere, not the physical moon, but within the moon sphere on the other side, the subtle version of the moon, contains beings within it that we call angels. Steiner retains you can call them anything you want, they're just spiritual beings. We have to call them something. And Steiner retains the vocabulary of Christianity for his sort of polytheism of gods. So these are angelic beings that are especially involved with karma and reconstructing a new astral body. And they help you not only reviewing your past life to see what happened, but you also have to experience the harm that you caused other people. So you re-experience, if you hurt someone physically, emotionally, however it is, you then experience what happened only from their point of view. So you feel their feelings as these moon beings, these angels on the lower part of the whole spectrum of, there's 9 levels to the angels, and the lower 3 are, he calls the third hierarchy, the third down from the highest, which are the archi, the archangels, and the angels. The angels are involved with the moon, and they help you do this process of rebuilding and reviewing your life. And then the other 2 angelic spheres are associated with Mercury then and with Venus. All of these will have to do with the construction of the lower side of man. The side that has to do, that's tied closely with the body and with the reproductive urge, the sex drive. All of these lower planets have to do with reconstructing that aspect of the physical body. While meanwhile then, as the astral body decays and it has to be reconstructed, the I, the ego, the individuality then ascends to the sphere of the sun sphere, which is of course a spiritual sun. It has very little to do with the real sun. It's the spiritual sun. And in that sphere, what is worked on, it's in relation to the middle beings of the hierarchy, the exugi, the dynamis, and the kairotets that have to do with the sphere of good qualities within you. Nothing bad that you ever did is allowed entry with you into the sun sphere. So a part of you gets left behind down at the level of the moon sphere while you are being processed with your good qualities in relation with these hierarchical beings in the sphere of the sun. Which meanwhile, your lower elements are being worked on by the lower angels of the first 3, the angels, archangels, and archi, in relationship with the highest angels, the cherubim, the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones, which are of course associated with Saturn, with Jupiter, and with Mars, and they are the judgmental beings. What happens, Steiner puts it this way, and maybe this is only metaphoric, but somehow the beings at the lower level of the moon communicate your misdeeds to this higher hierarchy, who then say, well, then it has to be this way. The karma needs to be. They tell the lower beings how to reshape the astral body in accordance with the bad things that you've done, and the karma that then requires compensation. Remember that karma has to do with the law of compensation. It's not an ethical judgment so much as the fact that if you harm somebody one way, you're going to experience the opposite of that. The harm will be done to you in another lifetime. Simply, there's a principle of cosmic homeostasis here. It's just the law of karmic balancing. So at the sphere of the sun then, the individual then descends back down through the spheres into the moon sphere, where he meanwhile now picks up the remade astral body that has been dictated to him by the higher hierarchy from the higher 3 planets, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. And now he has to have a new astral body and a new physical body, and these angelic beings on the 3 lower planets then help translate his karma into a physical body, physical actualization on the earth down below, where the individual is then reborn. Now, on the earth, on the physical plane of the earth, the planets also do radiate influences, he says. And he says, for example, the moon, the light of the moon that's reflected from the sun shines down on the earth, and it penetrates the earth, but only in a shallow way. It only goes down as far as the roots of the plants. So that light penetrates in a shallow way, but the light of the sun saturates the earth and descends very deeply into it, which is why Steiner says, for instance, you can plant potatoes in the winter, because that warmth of the sun is still buried down in the ground. But now recall Steiner's model of the threefold nature of the physical body, where he says we have the head system, which is associated with senses and the nervous system, and then we have the torso system that's associated with the circulation of the blood, the rhythmic process of breathing, and the head is associated with thinking, and the torso and the rhythmic system with feeling, and then the motor system with the limbs that is associated with willing. So he says that the sun actually works upon the head. It works upon the intellect as the light shines down, and it has something to do with your predisposition to illness or health. He says your predisposition to health comes from what you experienced on the other side in relationship to the sun powers, in relationship to the head system, because if something goes wrong in the head system, then it causes illnesses in the body. Whereas the lower planets, Moon, Mercury, Venus, all had to do with constructing the lower nature of the physical body and its sexual drive to procreate and so forth. And that has to do with, if something goes wrong there, that has to do with the predisposition to illness then. So these planets have an effect on your whether you get sick or healthy or what have you. And then Steiner also now gives this, looking at my notes here, he gives this interesting sort of model of the chronology of the human life. Now, as is well known, he's got the Waldorf school model where every 7 years the individual undergoes a transformation and requires a different level of teaching. And that's interesting because that echoes the in astrology, which Steiner generally rejected Western astrology. For some reason, he didn't like it. But it does correlate with Saturn cycles. Every 7 years, Saturn makes a major transit, usually a painful one, in your life in some way. So he gives this model, and he says that those three hierarchies, the upper hierarchy of the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones, the middle hierarchy of the exergite, dynamis, and kyriotets, and the lower hierarchy of the archangels and angels, are all connected with three different phases of the human life cycle. The lower hierarchy is connected with the first phase of the human life cycle from the age of about 0 to 21. That's all governed by the lower hierarchy of the angels. And the age from, and it overlaps with 14 to 35 as being involved with the middle hierarchy, and there's an overlap. And then the third hierarchy, the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones, apply to the ages between 35 and 49. And he says that the difference between the first half of life and the latter half of life, there's a mineralization process that begins to gain the upper hand over the etheric forces that energize and sustain and make the body. And those mineralization processes cause the human being, as he or she gets older, to become more brittle and sclerotic. And therefore, the mineral aspect of the physical body slowly begins to gain the upper hand. Whereas the early phase of the human life cycle, from let's say up into the 35 or so, is the animal vitality element that's very strong and very vital. And in between is the plant element of vitality. And all three of these are involved with these angelic hierarchies, and they overlap as you go along in your life cycle. And he says that very often, the first part of this life cycle that's governed by the lower hierarchy, the angels, the archangels, and the archi, that part of the life cycle has to do with karmic demands that are made, that have been put upon you and are now more thoroughly imprinted upon you during this early phase of your life. There's also karmic potential, and in the last third of the life cycle, from 28 to 49, is the period, he says, of karmic fulfillments or lack thereof. And he says, like a lot of people early on in life have show all different kinds of karmic possibilities. Children like to draw, paint, sculpt. They have all these artistic talents and skills that may go on all the way up into the 20s that get lost then in later life and then fall away. And in the period of old age, in the period of karmic fulfillments, then it just doesn't happen. So that karma has to be wiped out and reset for the other side. And so this is the model that he gives for the human life cycle. And then he breaks it down even further. He says that on the other side, as your soul was interacting, your ego, what he calls the ego, the I, was interacting with the different planetary spheres, the planetary spheres correlate also with the life cycle, again broken down further into every 7 years. And he says the age 0 to 7 is governed by the moon, the age of 7 to 14 is governed by Mercury, and the age of 14 to 21 by Venus, which is obvious there with Venus 14. We can see the sex drive coming in. And the sun governs the middle period from 21 to 42, which is the sort of the noontime period of your life, and the height should be the height of your faculties and powers. Mars comes in at 42 to 49, Jupiter at 49 to 56, and Saturn at 56 to 63. Which is about how old as Steiner himself lived. I think he was in his 60s when he died. But he gives three examples of three incarnations of three individuals that I find this very interesting here, because it seems like astrology can validate what he says here. He says that on the other side, there was a particular individuality, and this turns out to be Voltaire, the French thinker from the 18th century. On the other side, first, there was an incarnation Voltaire had as a Muslim. Yet again, we have another one of these Muslims who reincarnate into the West as a rationalistic or materialistically inclined thinker. And Steiner says that this Voltaire Muslim individual from about the 9th century lived in North Africa for a while and absorbed all kinds of currents of knowledge and migrated up into Spain, where he absorbed Kabbalistic learning from the Jews and all kinds of esoteric traditions associated with decaying schools of Islam that were dying out across the deserts of North Africa, that this individual retained and picked up with him. But then when he went on to the other side, after that life, received a particular karmic energy from the Mars sphere that made him aggressive. And then when he reincarnated as Voltaire, we get this individual with a very aggressive disposition because of this karma, which is coming from the Mars sphere in a very strong way. Voltaire was always picking fights. He was always in intellectual fights, always causing fights and problems and so forth. So I thought then, if that were true about Voltaire, then if I pulled up Voltaire's chart, his birth chart, then his Mars should be heavily aspected. And so indeed, that is exactly what his birth chart shows. When we look at the birth chart here of Voltaire, he has Mars conjunct Mercury, 17 degrees, Mercury is 17 degrees Sag, and Mars is 14 degrees Sag, very close, tight connection there. So that's intellectual aggressiveness precisely, and they are opposed by Uranus, which can have the tendency to create breakthroughs, or it can cause destabilizations. But in either way, Voltaire's Mars was very heavily aspected, especially through his intellect. With that Mercury there conjunct his Mars. See, astrology never lies. I'm learning this more and more as I go along through life over the decades of studying it. It's dead on every time. And so he talks about an individual, this turns out to be the esotericist Eliphaz Levi, about whom I know nothing, but who in between lives brought a particular Jupiter energy, which is associated with wisdom, according to Steiner. And he says that Eliphaz Levi was originally an Aztec priest. And he says this was a time during the period of the disintegration of the esoteric traditions amongst the Aztecs, where they were disintegrating into all this mass industry of sacrifice, what Gene Gebser would call the deficient modalities of both the magical and the mythical consciousness structure. The deficient modality of the magical consciousness structure is spell casting, black magic, the occult. The deficient modality of the mythical consciousness structure is human sacrifice. And so all these deficient, decaying modalities were coming in, while this individual who later reincarnated as Eliphaz Levi in about the year, what is it, to 1800, something like that, 1810, I think it is, picked up all of these traditions, and then on the other side had a particular interaction with the Jupiter sphere, which has to do with wisdom. And it is as though Steiner said such an individual should be born already wise, in a manner of speaking, should have aptitude. Maybe the child prodigy archetype comes from this. And he says this individual then reincarnated as Eliphaz Levi, and I thought, well then, if that's true, I don't know anything about this guy, but then his Jupiter should be very strongly aspected in his chart. And indeed, when we pull up the chart of Eliphaz Levi, we have, he was born February 8th, 1810. And indeed, he has Jupiter conjunct Moon sitting right on his ascendant. They are conjunct the ascendant, and they are opposed by Uranus. Once again, a very strongly aspected Jupiter, and that tends to bear out Steiner's idea here. And so he gives one more example of a past life, the past life of the novelist Victor Hugo. And he says that Victor Hugo, in between lives, had a particular interaction with the Saturn sphere, which Steiner, for some reason, associates with the past. Saturn has a very strong, of course, it has to do with old age. So naturally, when one enters into old age, there's a tendency to become nostalgic about looking back over your life, looking back over the past. And he says that this individuality that later reincarnated as Victor Hugo was originally an individual who was an initiate into the Hibernian mysteries of Ireland in about, once again, the 9th century, somewhere like that. He was an initiate in those mysteries. And when he went on to the other side, he had a particular interaction with the Saturn sphere that caused him then, when he was reborn in France as Victor Hugo, to have indeed a kind of romanticism and a nostalgia for the past. Victor Hugo's novels romanticized the Middle Ages, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, his fascination with the Gothic period and all of that. But once again, I thought, if this were true, then Victor Hugo's Saturn should be heavily aspected on his chart. And indeed, when we look at his chart, let's see, he was born, it looks like February 26, 1802, with Saturn conjunct Jupiter as his two highest planets. They're very close to his midheaven. So they are indeed very strong. Saturn is indeed very strongly aspected there. And not only that, but it's opposed 180 degrees by a very close stellium conjunction of Venus, Pluto, and the Sun, all opposing that very tight orb between Saturn and Jupiter, which, once again, the birth charts bear out Steiner's insights into the individual energies that these individuals must be receiving from the other side. So there must be some truth to this somehow, that when we go onto the other side, there is some sort of interaction with these planetary energies and the different planetary beings, and each one of these is associated with a cluster. Each planet, according to Steiner, is associated with a cluster of planetary beings that are involved in our bodies, actually, that are involved in our, he says there's a certain faculty that you can develop. He has these three faculties: imagination, inspiration, intuition. And imagination has to do simply with, like, the Jungian collective unconscious. It has to do with perceiving things in terms of images that liberate your mind from your senses so that you don't just have to rely on your senses. That's imaginative cognition. But he says with inspirational cognition, there are no images. What happens is a kind of shamanic astral body transflight. You're able to actually leave the physical body together with the etheric body, and the ego takes the astral body with it and is able to leave and go on to the other side and then come back into the body and to view the body as being inhabited by this polytheism of spiritual beings that are involved in all of the very dense layers of architecture of our subtle body. So we'll leave it there for this discussion of Steiner's karmic relationships.